Thanks, Gary. And unfortunately, neither of my alma maters fared too well in the NCAA tournament. But it's a pleasure being here this morning. Of course, you guys roughed it in the weather. I appreciate everybody making effort to be here. Fighting the flu a little bit, so my head's a little bit in a cloud, so kind of keep the questions relatively easy through the panel. A little bit about Ohio EPA. We're one of the first three state EPAs in the country. We just finished celebrating our 40th birthday as an agency. So we were actually some members in the audience were here right at the very beginning back in '73. Just to give an example, when I came over from Indiana, I ran back out there last year and they just celebrated their 25th year. So that just shows you the differences in some of the maturation of some of the state agencies. Being one of the first original ones, a lot of our rulemaking that we have in process kind of leads the charge. And you hear that a lot on the oil and gas side. So a lot of our team has been there, done that, and bought that T-shirt. I mean, we've done it. So you look at oil and gas in the state of Ohio, the only thing that's different today than what was happening over 100 years ago is it's the horizontal play. We've been doing vertical drilling in the state of Ohio for a long time. And when I listen to some of my counterparts, we often travel in packs. We talk about fracking. And I know that's a big issue of concern. There have been over 85,000 fracks in the state of Ohio since 1948. 85,000 fracks. Fracking is not new. The technology now is it's the horizontal play on the frack. They're getting right into the shale seam itself and having the frack instead of the upper layers of some of the sandstone, where they're shattering the sandstone. And all fracking is, just to put out by definition, is it's fracturing. And they're using high pressure water to fracture. And then once they fracture that, then they put sand in it to hold it open. So that when Mother Nature, with all the pressure of the earth comes down on it, you can hold that seam open with pieces of sand. And then it works kind of like a French drain. It allows the gas, liquids, and everything to fill into that seam and then end up in the pipe. So a lot of people use the F word in vain, God love them. But really, we've been doing it for a long time. It's not new. And you talk about the state of Ohio. We had one of the first offshore drilling in the state of Ohio. Happened to be Grand Lake St. Mary's. Happened to only be about 5 foot of water. But it was not the Gulf. It was Ohio that led that. And with our counterparts in the legislature that had some foresight to do 165, some historical bills that allowed for a very strong regulatory regime in the state of Ohio, we've been ahead of the curve. And then as we've been progressing through this now, the new play, both the Utica and Marcellus play, we've been learning from our neighbors. I've spent a lot of time in both Pennsylvania and West Virginia. North Dakota, Dave Platt and his team, Dave's a personal friend of mine. I'm on the phone with him very frequently. And then, of course, Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana, all the directors there's only 51 of us, and we're a close-knit group. And we spent a lot of time together. I was in Phoenix just a couple of weeks ago as we were working through some of the budget issues because we all share some of the federal pieces of the budget. So we were together working through some of those issues. And of course, we all took an afternoon while we were there to discuss where each of the states are at on a regulatory regime on oil and gas. And again, Ohio has been out leading the charge. Just to give you a couple of examples. The federal government, and you hear a lot of it on Frac Focus, the chemical reporting piece. DNR has already been ahead of that, and we report quarterly. Now, for those of you that are business in this room, traditional business reporting is in March for the calendar year before. And that's when you report your chemical usages. It's done once a year, and it's done in March for the previous calendar year. We've asked the regulatory community on fracking to report quarterly. Now, there's this whole big issue about all the secret ingredients and holy cow, but for those of you that are familiar with material safety data sheets, that's the listing of materials that are in these chemicals. As they list them down by what's in them from a percentage standpoint. They traditionally start with water at about 98.5%. Then the next one is sand, and then they work down through some of the various chemicals to keep it from molding and add an algae, so they got an algicide in it. They need to make sure that when they push it out horizontally, they can keep that sand in solution, so there's a gel in it so that it doesn't settle out in the bottom of the hole, so it's got a gel in it. And then it's just like your mom's cooking. She's got that little secret ingredient that makes that one frac different from another, and it's in the very, very small percentages. And that's reported to DNR, it's just not reported to the public, unless it's requested from a doctor. But the concentrations of that are so minuscule. So then the question will be, well, emergency responders, we just had the DNL issue. You gotta know what's in it. No, I don't need to know that level of detail. My folks do not need to know that level of detail when they're responding. They need to know if it's an acid. They need to know if it's flammable. Too much detail puts noise in the system, and the first responders get caught up in the noise. My first responders, which I have quite a few of them, obviously on the DNL one, you've heard all that play out in the media, they need to know whether it's hazardous or not. They need to know whether it's an acid or not. They don't need to know whether it was acetic acid or formic acid. They just need to know that if it's an acid. So they have the right PPE on, personal protection equipment on, so that they can respond. Too much detail gets caught in noise. Noise confuses. And at that first responder level, you need to be able to close that crisis window as fast as possible. I don't need to know that level of detail out of the gate. And I get enough reporting on the quarterly to make sure that we're reporting to the feds on 312s and 313s. So I'm fine with that. So I don't need an additional level of reporting, which you've heard a lot of noise played out here by some of our folks. That's not the case. Don't need that level of information. And by the way, it's like pissing in the ocean looking for high tide. It is small volume. It is very small volume. And it's not the level of volume that I need to be. Not that I'm not worried about all detail. I am worried about all detail. But that's the detail stuff that gets caught in noise. So I just wanted to make sure we got that out on the table. But you also look at some of the things that we've done from a permitting standpoint. Our air permits in the state of Ohio are in play now for oil and gas. The federal government is on their NSPS permit process. It'll go in play in 2014. We're 2013. We actually had it in play in 2012. So we permit oil and gas sites now from an air collection standpoint. We're in the process of a couple of other general permits that are out for public comment right now that'll help on compressor stations, which one of our panelists is going to be representing that group. So we're trying to stay ahead of the curve from a general permitting standpoint on the air side. We also monitor. I have monitors out there on a lot of these oil and gas sites, both prior to and post, so we have a good baseline. On the drinking water side of the house, a lot of samples were done prior to. You got to remember, Ohio's been in oil and gas for a long time, and because of our geology, we're ripe for it. And just because you're picking up methane in somebody's drinking water does not necessarily mean that it was a fracking instance. We sit on a geology that has caused us to be fortunate to have oil and gas. So as things break down underground, let me give you an example. I grew up in upstate New York, Binghamton. You heard the whole play on the, whatever that movie was, where they lit the Gasland. Thank you very much, Senator. So when they lit the little water fountains, I was one of those snotty-nosed kids that lit the water fountain. Had nothing to do with oil and gas. It was built on bogs. It had a floating concrete slab. The point well for the school was at about 35 feet. It was on a sand spur. So the least path of resistance for methane, because it was built on a bog, was up through the well. So when you were the first kid, my mom and dad worked, so I had to be dropped off pretty early. So when you were the first kid in school, you'd walk up to the water fountain and you could hear that from the gas methane, and it would light on fire. And oh, by the way, there was no fracking going on around it, but it made good movies. And it's because it was built on Iroquois. The Iroquois Indians used to cut the ground in little squares and burn it. That's how rich it was in methane. So when you put a school on it and lay that concrete foundation on that and trap that methane underneath the concrete, the only way it's going to come up is through the least path of resistance, which happens to be the drinking water well that's sitting down at about 25 feet. But by God, it makes good movies. So again, when we have issue on a lot of that, we've done a lot of baseline on drinking water here. You got to look at also the topography. There's a lot of stray gas in our water systems. It's completely irrelevant of the oil and gas play. It's just the nature of the beast of being in Ohio. Just like our TDS issue that the good mayor and I have been working on some of the rivers. We are hard water in the state. We all know it when we got up and took a shower this morning. So it's not unlikely for us to have TDS, total dissolved solids, of greater than 1,000 in our water. Doesn't mean that it's unsafe, just means that it's high. And we have to monitor and make sure we don't get too high. So we've got air permits. We've been handling wastewater and water. Our friends at the universities have been helping us at an incredible pace on trying to develop technologies to be able to recirculate a lot of this water. You look at what's happening. We're fortunate that we're flush with water in Ohio, no pun intended there. But you get to like North Dakota where it's very dry. North Dakota's not. So that we've been partnering up with North Dakota and the University of North Dakota to try to work through technology. Theirs are driven because they can't get access to water. Ours are driven because we do have access to water, but we want to protect it. So we're coming at it slightly different. But I'll tell you what, it's exciting to see the partnerships. And Ohio State, I met with them 3 times last week, just 3 separate occasions as we're working through this technology. And it's not as simplistic as reverse osmosis because you've got a lot of complexities in this waste stream. So as we work through those, and we will, because there's a driver on it, there's an economic driver on it, because these are multi-million gallon frac and drill uses. But then you put it in perspective. You know, I came up from Columbus yesterday. Columbus, on an average day, uses about 270 million gallons, 7 days a week, of water. 270 million gallons a day, 7 days a week. A typical frac is between 4 and 5 million gallons. And then it's a one-time frac. You might have multiple fracs in a hole, but they're in different stages, but it's a one-time frac. So even if you have, say, 10 fracs in that horizontal, you're talking 50 million gallons over the 80-year life of that well. So 50 million gallons, say we have a couple of thousand wells, so you just start doing the math in your head and then always compare it back to 273 million gallons of water 7 days a week, 365 days in the city of Columbus alone. And we have a lot of cities of Columbus size in the state of Ohio. Just put some things in perspective. So water side, stormwater general permit, 401, our wetlands program, that's got a general permit out. So we tried to get ahead of the curve on oil and gas so that we can spend more time regulating and less time doing paperwork. So I was real big on instituting general permits when I came on board a couple of years ago. So now we can run through a general permit in about 15 or 18 days, not be in the way of the oil and gas folks, yet still be able to regulate them, and that's the key. We want to make sure that we're all on it together. We're all holding each other's hand together because this is Ohio. So on the oil and gas side, I'm very comfortable where we're at in a position from an environmental standpoint. And I give a lot of testimony in D.C. on it, so you can tell I'm passionate on it, and we know the subject matter. My team, Kurt Prinzik and his group up in this part of the state, they know the play. They know their folks at DNR. We work together as a team. It was very evident on the DNL thing. And that's one of the first ones of those we've had, so that was kind of the first one to fumble through, but it was still smooth as silk. And I wouldn't expect anything different. Our budget, we're in the middle of our budget season. Thank you, Senator. And at some point, we actually might have a budget, and I know it's not his fault. This is a challenge. We were kidding about it for breakfast this morning. Our budgets are incredibly complicated. And when you start to unravel one, it's kind of like you pull it off your tie, and the next thing you know, your whole tie's laying on the ground. So you got to be careful on which string you pull. From Ohio EPA standpoint, I have a couple of different opportunities, I guess is probably the best word. You know, obviously I have federal funding, and we just fell off the cliff a couple of weeks ago. So we've been working through handling the federal component of the budget. It's not a surprise. They just changed the name. Initially, it was a rescission. Remember, we've been under a continuing resolution at the federal level for the last 18 months.